Hello. Have you ever wanted to experience a game where you control an adorable creature and delve into the depths of a hostile planet? Have you ever wanted that creature to get hit in the head by a stalactite, resulting in brain damage and an infection that spreads until the delirium causes them to stumble into a pit and die? Well, regardless of your intents, that game exists. Casualties Unknown, a formerly Scav prototype, released a demo on Steam recently, and I've actually had my eye on this one for a while. I usually prefer to talk about games when they're finished, but it's been getting some attention recently, and I'll be damned if some sensationalist makes the most brutal survival game ever before mine. The game begins as a drop pod is sent down to the surface. The beginning is nebulous, and the creature you control is some kind of genetic experiment created by humanity, ostensibly for the purpose of unethical experiments. Some cargo is mistakenly sent to this planet, and you're the expendable fodder they sent to try and get it back. The actual finale isn't implemented yet, so it's purely a MacGuffin, but the how and why is less important than the immediate goal of not dying. Every experiment, or XP for short, has a unique ID, and every death is canon, and on top of all the bodies you'll find, you'll be adding many more casualties yourself. There's no putting this off. Again, as much as I dislike sensationalism, it's impossible to discuss this game without acknowledging that it is, by design, dark, bleak, and morbid. This game is not something that shies away from topics grim. If you fall, your character will cry out in agony. If you step on glass, you'll be forced to listen to their heart racing as they beg you to stop pulling at the shards. If you have a gun in your inventory and their mood falls too low, it is definitionally a brutal game. Some will praise it for its grim realism, while others will dismiss it as performative and edgy, with the harshest invective levied at it being that anyone who plays it must have a fetishistic interest in suffering. These are all the topics I'll be exploring eventually, but first it must be explained. The primary feature is the full physical simulation of each of the character's body parts. You can get swept away, ragdoll, and generally tumble in many realistic ways. If you're using a headlamp, you're reliant on your character actually turning their head to illuminate what's beyond, and if you accidentally let your toe drift over a bear trap, you're going to have problems. Each limb is tracked individually and can be injured individually. Bad falls will hurt your legs, and getting your head slammed into the ceiling by a jump pad is going to give you one hell of a concussion. The most salient comparison is barotrauma, which also has procedural animation and limb health. It's also a game I talked about previously, and one of my major complaints there was the lack of the depth in the medical department. And let me tell you, that is something that Casualties Unknown certainly delivers in. My XP once took a nasty blow to the ribs. I thought he was walking it off at first, only to later realize that their heartbeat was suddenly all over the place, and that's because the internal bleeding that I couldn't see had suddenly caused enough pressure to build up in the pleural cavity behind the ribs to cause the heart to fibrillate and partially collapse a lung. The only reason he survived is because I had a chest drain on me to help let the blood out and release the pressure. Yes, I have always wanted to experience the pleasure of a hemothorax. This is a game where blood viscosity is not only tracked, but is a meaningful stat. I accidentally took too many stimulants once, and I'm pretty sure the spike in blood pressure gave my XP a stroke. It's partially inspired by the barotrauma mod Neurotrauma, or maybe the expansive medical system of Space Station 13, but in this dismal setting, it's really come into its own. The graphics are vaguely reminiscent of Starbound, complete with destructible tile-based scenery and crafting, but you're not really in the business of putting the blocks back once you've torn them up. You'll find yourself needing to dig through the dirt quite often to get around. Ideally, you'll have some sort of tool to help, but if you're empty-handed, your XP can always use their claws. Different tiles have different durabilities, and so if you got no choice, you'd much rather dig through gravel than rock. Exerting the XPs too much can make them winded, and you'll need to take a break every so often to let them catch their breath. Injuries such as a bruised thorax will affect how well they can respirate and slow down recovery time. The game has some light RPG mechanics with strength, resilience, and intelligence stats that all increase as you play the game. Strength is trained from attacking things and carrying lots of weight, or doing actual strength training like push-ups to pass the time. You'll mainly get resilience from surviving grievous injuries, and intelligence is trained by crafting and advancing levels. Without intelligence, you won't be able to identify a lot of the tools and medicines that you can find lying around, but they're not randomized, so you can eventually bypass most of this by just, remembering what everything looks like. It's educational too, because eventually you'll be like, oh, ceftriaxone, I could use an antibiotic. The core of the gameplay is to descend deeper into the planet while doing your best to avoid horrific bodily harm. To help you along the way, you'll find several discarded crates, but to open them, you'll need to do these kinetic mini-games. I remember advocating for these all the way back in my potion games video, and I'm glad to see them appearing more often. Especially in a game as visceral as this, it lends a good weight and intimacy to what you're doing. There's lockpicking and keypad minigames for accessing the cargo, and while they might look like unnecessary time wasters in a game like this, forcing you to take your eyes off your environment long enough to enter the correct code can occasionally be quite nail-biting. These minigames are at their most tense in the injuries. Covering a bleeding leg with a bandage is one thing, but picking out shrapnel piece by piece is another. If you try to remove them too quickly, it'll only make it hurt more, and the more it hurts, the more unsteady their hands become, which makes it even more likely that you'll mess it up. There's all sorts of minigames, such as injecting syringes, resetting dislocated bones after a nasty fall, as well as amputating your limbs. There's even a minigame for when their mood becomes so dismal that they, scratch themselves with the direct intent to no longer remain corporeal. Fun stuff, right? Beyond that, it's a mostly standard loot and scoot kind of roguelite gameplay where you hoard items to try and turn the odds in your favor. Most of your efforts will be spent anxiously descending platform by platform, picking at anything you can come across. Your inventory is limited though, and at some point you'll be forced to choose between items. You have 6 major slots, being the arms, parts of the back, and the mouth. The arm can hold things, or use them if they're weapons, but holding onto them also carries the risk that a bad fall could make your character lose their grip on them. I've lost more than once after losing my only light source that way. 6 slots is extremely limiting, but you can up that by crafting your own bags or by finding them in boxes and trading with other survivors. These all have their own limits, but they are absolutely necessary if you want to be able to carry the many life-saving medications that you're going to need. There's also equipment you can wear, like helmets, which are great for avoiding concussions. You also have a weight tolerance, and if you're overweight, movement will be more tiring and less effective, but carrying that much more is often worth the penalty. There's also crafting you can do if you're hoarding base materials. There's a lot of options here, but outside of the few bags at the start and some bandages, it's sometimes difficult to justify the sheer effort required to make the higher tier items. I'm going to be honest, nearly dying of thirst while trying to do the final part of the crafting tutorial kind of made me want to which is pretty on brand for this game, I suppose. You also need to make sure to carry around food, water, tools, and all sorts of other things. It can become very fiddly very quickly, but it's the natural consequence of this kind of complexity, and outside of just moving them around into crafting, it's fairly straightforward. The most important piece of your kit, however, is your light source. You start the game with a crappy flashlight whose battery can't be replaced, and so getting something better is your highest priority. As it turns out, in the game where the smallest slip can prove fatal, being able to see what's below you is pretty important. The most consistent way to get one is by trading with other survivors, but if you're lucky, you'll find one in a box. If you implement all those basics, your XP might survive a whole hour longer than the average. You might have noticed that I've been careful to separate the player and the thing that they're controlling, and that's very much intentional. The XPs are obviously controlled by you, but there's a distinct impression that you're only guiding them. They talk to themselves, react to danger, and will sometimes even refuse your command if they're too upset, which is normally an awful mechanic, but here it somehow works perfectly. Clearly this demonstrates that Lester the Unlikely would have been more tolerable if we were allowed to brutalize him. These constant dialogues that the XPs have with themselves makes it difficult for the player to project themselves onto them, which is further exacerbated by the occasional "we" that they throw around. It forces you to take the role of a caretaker rather than that of the protagonist. If you were meant to treat them exclusively as an avatar, none of this game's mechanics would have any higher meaning, because no matter what the game could say to you, you are not experiencing it. You cannot feel pain simply because it told you to. When I die in Teleglitch, I'd say, "Oh, I died." I would never say, "Damn it, they died." And yet here I find myself saying exactly that. There's plenty of games where this separation of the player and the character as a distinct entity is wider, but when I see Lara Croft smash face first into a wall, I don't feel a thing. Except maybe amusement. Games like One Shot, Darkest Dungeon, and also I guess like Lifeline on the PlayStation all toy around with this concept of the player as a guiding entity. In the case of Lifeline, it was a little too clumsy to be truly effective, but handled correctly it can create an intense affective connection with the characters, but never has it been so visceral as it is here. When Darkest Dungeon tests your hero's resolve and they come out on top, it is Kino of the highest caliber, and it's the same here. This conceptual pulling back from the first to the third person is the most singular aspect of Casualties Unknown. Whether an intentional design decision or not, it is effectively the entire game's thesis expressed in grammar. It informs everything that the game is about. It can't make you feel pain, but it can show you something that does. It can't reach out of the screen and hurt you, but it can wrench your heart. When I hear them whimpering after I accidentally sent them tumbling down a pit, it makes me feel bad. I mean, I don't know what you want me to say. You might think that as a professional gamer I would min-max life by speccing into the sociopathy perk, but I'm a masochist who likes a challenge, so I've been running with the empathy debuff this whole time. It's a tough playstyle, but occasionally rewarding. The game tells you that when something terrible happens to them, it's your fault. You did this. What are you going to do about it? I can't deny its efficacy, but it raises the question, if playing it is intentionally distressing, why play it at all? Well, why do people watch horror movies? At some point, experiencing anything, even negative emotions, is simply stimulating. Morbid as it may be, it's true, and yet engagement is not endorsement. Regardless, this is mainly what critics of its content will point at. It is a double-edged sword. By separating the player and the character so effectively, what you've done is essentially give them something to inflict pain upon. Whether you're playing as the Protector or the Tormentor, the fact remains the same, that through your actions, something will suffer. In that way, it seems that only a sadist would enjoy a game like this. And look, I'm not going to deny that maybe there's some people out there who might genuinely feel that way towards this game, but if you want to strip down any form of art just because it could be taken that way, you might as well rip apart all the challenging culture we have. Beyond that, it's an issue of intensity. Some might ask, is it really necessary to show all of this with such visceral detail? Must you show the whole agonizing process of them pulling shrapnel out of their face? Does this all truly warrant having 45 separate lines of dialogue for when they try to commit Sudoku? It might give off the impression that rather than simply trying to communicate the macabre for dramatic effect, it much prefers to revel in it. I don't think that that's necessarily untrue, but it's far from irredeemable. I mean, compare this to any of the 2000s torture games you could find on Newgrounds, or all of the heinous things people did to the interactive buddy back in the day. Playing this, I was reminded of an old Flash game I played from 2006 called Dark Cut, in which you also do grisly surgeries through a series of kinetic mouse movements, but it's all spectacle. Beyond the initial transgression of its shocking content, there's just not much there. This is the key difference. I would find this game much more difficult to defend if not for the pure, simple fact that the suffering it portrays is not only a senseless spectacle, it has a purpose. It is something to be avoided. It is the punishment for failure. It's grim, yes. It's shocking, yes. But it is also perhaps the most powerful motivator to succeed I've encountered in a game yet. It meshes with the survival mechanics flawlessly and pulls the player into the game in a very real way. There are some people who will never accept this and see it as ontologically evil, but in a word, it is compelling. Obviously, its efficacy depends on your ability to empathize with computer programs, and some people won't feel any of this at all, but I can't even bring myself to use the grubs in White Knuckle because they're too adorable, so I'd say I'm pretty susceptible. It would be a different story if the game encouraged it, but at no point are you required to brutalize them in order to gain an advantage. It is purely something to be avoided. It's a strange effect. I'd occasionally tumble right out of the drop pod and break something, but instead of immediately quitting to the menu and restarting, I'd always play it out even though it was much more inconvenient. I once stepped on a landmine and lost an eye. It was a grievous injury that made the game more annoying to play, and in any other game I probably would have given up, but after picking out shrapnel for several minutes, and even though it seemed hopeless after the unchecked internal bleeding had collapsed a lung, I refused to give up. I managed to find a trader who had a chest drain on them, and I managed to save the tough little guy. It's an incredible sense of responsibility that this game shackles you with. Unfortunately, there's no ending in the demo, so any success is transitory, but as soon as there's an ending that doesn't result in death, the desire to drag yourself through thick and thin will only intensify. This is also when I'll caution the developer that despite the bleak setting, there needs to be at least one unambiguously good ending. There's games that can bear an utterly nihilistic ending, but when the whole premise is survival, not having an ending that can at least fit the definition would feel unfortunate. To borrow an art term, it's all about the chiaroscuro. In a game as intensely dark as this, it only makes the lights stand out that much more, but no one's getting anything out of a one-tone canvas. Ultimately, I just don't think that this game is all that sadistic. It's actually quite the opposite. It obviously comes from a very dark place and is utterly replete with angst, but what's wrong with angst? Searching up songs on YouTube for one of my favorite bands gives me a self-help line. I've been there, and I just don't get the impression that the developer revels in suffering all that much. It's much more likely that they just take comfort in it as a morbid fixation. I will resist the urge to lapse into psychoanalysis, but there are a handful of reasons that someone might prefer these dismal settings. There's an innocent and adorable creature in a horrible situation. Who wouldn't empathize with that? I do think that most of the accusations of fetishism come from it being within the blast radius of the furry fandom, but it's far from the first to leverage the effects of cute things in dark settings. Games like Nine Souls still manage to have a deeply philosophical bent alongside its anthropomorphic characters, and games like Fuga Melodies of Steel lets you use furry children as ammunition. For what it's worth, and regardless of the creator's pre-existing proclivities, I think the decision to make the character an anthropomorphic creature was the correct one. It makes it more difficult to project into, which helps the separation that I talked about. And without any presupposition of race, culture, or creed, it allows the player to take in everything purely as the here and now. There is no expectation for how these things are supposed to behave, so they can do whatever they want. There is a lot of performative song and dance that humans do to keep from being seen as weird or soft by other humans, and though it might make the injuries in the game that much more visceral if there was an extra layer of human familiarity, it would also carry along with it some of those implicit shames. If it were a human whimpering in a heap, I could imagine someone thinking, oh, stop whining, because they'd end up projecting that implicit shame onto them. Also, I guess that some people might just really like these creatures. The design of the experiments themselves is simplistic, but effective at what it needs to do, similar to the slug cats from Rain World. There's two other types of sapient creatures that you'll find as survivors, and they're described as being derived from the original experiment, but that is all ostensibly in the same universe as one of the developers' earlier projects called Gunsaw, in which there are 14 separate ones. The designs have a very early 2000s DeviantArt vibe to them, and honestly, I think that's beautiful, but it was definitely the correct choice to pare them down. It's more forgivable in a gratuitously violent shooter styled something after Madness Combat, but this game tugs on completely different strings. I should mention that the central fanbase of this game is the kind of Discord furries I tend to avoid, but at the moment it hasn't bled into the game more than tolerable. I'm hesitant to even mention it because it'll sound like I'm implying something, but the developer is surprisingly young. Regardless, there's a very precocious understanding of gameplay fundamentals. It's in the simple things, such as the way the game communicates velocity. Gravity is your bitterest rival in this game, and when you jump and fall, you'll get this progressive whooshing sound as you pick up speed. When you're tumbling uncontrollably, it perfectly blends into the painful crunch that follows. The sound effect for landing is also dynamic depending on your velocity, and this simple feedback allows the player to slowly suss out the limits of what's safe via operant conditioning. There is no end to my praise for the sound design of this game. My biggest complaint I had when I was reviewing Barotrauma was the lack of reactive sound effects. I wanted groaning hulls, gurgling water, and a horrifying cacophony of alarms to immerse you in the dread, but instead it felt very barren. Casualties Unknown is an incredible example of what can happen when you properly invest in the soundscape. The heartbeat monitor thumping away as you desperately try to stitch together what's left of their skin is a masterclass in diegetic feedback. And when it goes haywire as you search frantically for any medicine that could possibly help, there is a certain hollow contemplation as the tone of the flatline marks the end of your run. Because the minigames are dynamic, a single sound file doesn't cut it. This is usually something you'll see in VR games, but it's got to react realistically based on how quickly you're unspooling a roll of bandages or plucking shrapnel out of your wounds. The way it squelches only when you're actually moving it adds an extra layer to the visceral feedback, and that's hardly talking about the incredibly reactive soundtrack. It sits mostly in the background, but when you're in a dangerous situation, it'll seamlessly ramp up the intensity. When you're in dire straits, it lapses into this deep, unsettling drone that just exacerbates the dread of losing all of your blood. I'm going to be honest, the first time I experienced the sound cannon, I nearly crapped myself. It's very immersive, and every successful run feels like a story in of itself. In one run, I started out with my customary shower, and immediately out of the pod I saw some ammunition next to a corpse. I grabbed it, and then accidentally stepped onto a jump pad. Fortunately, he didn't hit his head too hard, and landed with some only minor bruising. After doing the customary early game crafting, I set off with some foliage bags and a makeshift headlamp. Also, I love how you can ragdoll to scoot through smaller gaps. I accidentally ate some foliage instead of putting it in the bag and immediately vomited, but it's fine. I find another pod that's been recently uninhabited and find some relief cream, which is great for disinfecting. It's also where I take a nap. After heading down to the next layer, I find a broken duffel bag and spend a while mending it into a functioning backpack so I can get even more storage. This is when I accidentally stepped onto a bear trap. To be fair, I thought it would be safe as long as I didn't drop down, but unfortunately that broke his hand. It also helps if you try to keep the blood inside their body. I can't carry anything in that hand until the fracture heals, which makes using my only light source more difficult. I was able to find a survivor to hang out with and managed to trade for a rifle as well as a bone welder. As it turns out, it's a bit painful to weld your bones back together, but it dropped the time to heal down to only a few minutes. Now I've just got to make sure it doesn't get infected. You can sleep next to other survivors to increase their morale, and by the time they're up, his hand is at least functional. I make my way down to the desert layer, and accidentally let a stalactite fall onto my head. At least he was wearing a helmet, but granite is not a comfortable thing to land on. When the skin and muscles are this damaged, you'll run the risk of infection. Fortunately, the pods you come across have a disinfecting shower in them, but you can't rely on finding them. Then I get in a tussle with a wall biter. I should have used my gun. I thought I'd try and preserve it, but I paid the price. I jumped down here to try and reposition, and then another stalactite sent him tumbling all the way down. Fortunately, some phantom oil broke most of the fall, but this is some insane bleeding. I had to use almost all of my bandages. And after it all, he ended up losing almost a third of his blood. The screen is all washed out just because there's so little blood left in there. Fortunately, I had an IV filled with Ringer's solution. It's not as good as blood, but it'll at least get the pressure up. Even after injecting the whole thing, he is still missing nearly a liter of blood, and he's overhydrated too. Not much to do but sleep in the sand and then move on. The danger of still being reliant on the emergency flashlight is that I didn't see this barbed wire fence until it was too late, but it's okay, it's just a scratch. The real risk is from infection, but fortunately these glow fruits are an antibacterial in a pinch. I head into the wasteland layer, and I am spawned on top of an incredibly radioactive rock, which is a little irritating to be honest. This place is so hot, and all the jumping around I need to do is making him overheat. I thought I was being careful, but he ends up getting a little heat stroke, and I've just got to wait it out. Then I realize that his foot is infected. It's probably from all the radiation around. All I can do is try and treat it and wait for it to go away. I find another pod, which is a blessing because I can set the AC to cool and to chill out for a moment. Unfortunately, I've managed to get some major radiation sickness, and it's messing up his entire body. He's getting infections left and right, and combined with the heat, he is suffering some brain damage. At least I've got enough antibiotics for now, and I've found some painkillers. Further down, it's not as hot either, so we might just make it out of here. And this is when I made the fatal blunder of jumping near this cactus. It touched his toe, and he immediately ragdolls, slamming his head right against the electric coil, totally frying his brains. There's not much I can do. The brain damage is too severe to even play anymore. If I had some brain grow, it would be salvageable, but I don't. I decide to forge on into the next layer with one final valiant effort, but it is nearly impossible when he keeps dropping everything and the screen keeps flipping. I'm just standing around at the start, and then I'm immediately faced with a monster of Layer 5. I try to take out my gun, but he immediately drops it. I try to run away, but it is nearly impossible. It bites off his leg, and I am left with too much bleeding and not enough bandages to solve it. It is truly the end of the line, and at the end I use every last drop of those painkillers I picked up to send him off, and the fact that I felt a moral obligation to let him die peacefully speaks volumes about this game. Love it or hate it, it makes you feel something, which is more than I can say about the vast majority of video games published these days. Even at this early stage, it is perhaps the most compelling survival game I've played, and I've played a lot of them, so it's irritating to hear people dismissing it out of hand due to its content, when that's precisely what makes it compelling. Regardless of the actual intent, there is some inevitability to these sorts of topics. If you wanted to make a game with an incredibly deep and realistic injury system, well, it's probably going to require something getting injured, but this way of handling it is actually far more graceful than any of those Newgrounds games I mentioned. Beyond that, this is far from the first game to utilize shocking content in this way. I suppose going all the way back, you have something like Cannon Fodder with its overly long dying animations for some of the enemy soldiers, and moving further ahead you have something like Red Orchestra 2's extremely lurid death rattles. There's nearly 40 minutes of these, by the way. The question becomes, why is this seen as more legitimate? It does raise the question, though, why is gunning people down seen as a legitimate form of entertainment while a game like this draws scrutiny? I doubt I'm the first person to question just how realistic you would need to make a shooter before the vast majority of people would lose the stomach for it. It would be perfectly feasible to make a shooter like that, but what's the utility? The entire game would just be pointing at the player asking, "Don't you feel bad?" In fact, that's exactly what Spec Ops: The Line was, and while I think at the time it was an effective subversion of an era overly saturated with jingoistic war shooters, at its core it was still forcing the player to commit war crimes, then telling them they're a bad person for doing it.
This is your fault, Walker.
What was I supposed to do, not play the game? Where Casualties Unknown deviates from that is that, once again, the most shocking content is intended to be avoided. Maybe this sounds like when Postal claimed that it didn't deserve to be censored because violence wasn't necessary to beat the game, but that's my perspective, and it's the only one I can give you. Hopefully this rambling meant something, because this didn't really end up being much of a game review. I mean, I guess I could say that, like, the blocks that are nearly indistinguishable from the background in the first two layers are annoying, the level generation is occasionally totally messed up, and the glass shards could use more than one model as you pluck them out, but it's still in beta, and that's all polish. The higher tier crafting is extremely convoluted compared to just opening crates, and it falls into the sort of optimal tedium that I usually advise against. But it's a recent addition, so it'll probably be smoothed out some more in the future. There's a lot I could say about the story, or lack thereof, but it's in beta and I have reason to believe it'll be changed in the future, so no comment. These are my patrons, by the way, and they don't exactly fund videos like this. It's mostly that I've been holding them hostage with my Factorio videos, and they need to humor me by watching videos like this to get more of them. Still, hopefully this video is interesting and informative. Okay, bye.